Well, thank you very much for coming today. Bright Blue is doing a project which is trying to develop a new balanced centre-right approach on immigration, and that project has various components, including this commission today. The Commission has included written evidence submitted by individuals and organisations which we received in August, and today is the oral evidence session which is being filmed, and both of those bits of evidence will be published in a final report at the end of this year as an appendix, and on top of that there will be some policy recommendations from Bright Blue. The commissioners here today are from a range of backgrounds and have different perspectives. They won't necessarily endorse everything Bright Blue says at the end in their final report. However, they would no doubt have some searching questions for you today. So what I'll do is kick off by asking you to introduce yourself and say a few introductory remarks on how immigration affects work and poverty in the UK. We'll then go to questions from the commissioners. So what I'll do is I will start with Owen and then move on.
Okay, I'm Owen Tudor. I'm the head of the European Union and International Relations Department at the TUC, and I'm responsible for TUC policy on migration. I think possibly, without wanting to take up too much time with opening remarks, I'd say that I'm uncertain to an extent whether it's actually migration that has had an impact on work and poverty in the UK, or how the UK has responded to migration, or how people in the UK have used migration that has had a bigger impact. Because I think in reality we are, over the last 10 or 15 years, we have been experiencing the outcome of a shift towards a less regulated labour market, and that has coloured an enormous amount of what's happened in reaction to the free movement of workers that took place when Eastern European countries joined the European Union. And in that regard, therefore, the polling that we've done and the discussions with our members in workplaces suggests that the key issues that people are facing as a result of migration are about undercutting job opportunities, exploitation, segregated workforces, and then spilling out into competition for public resources and the way communities are shaped. But I think it's important to say that it's the way in which we've reacted to migration that's the issue, and a managed migration system that would address that problem is not just about what happens at the border. It's about what happens in society, how you manage everything else that happens inside society as a result.
Okay, thank you, Owen. Let's move to Neil now.
Hi, yes, good morning. So I'm Neil Jameson, I'm the Director of Citizens UK, and the purpose of Citizens UK is to support people's participation in public life. So governance is our issue, not so much immigration as such, but inevitably our members who are all institutions. So our second purpose is to strengthen institutions, and we happen to recruit fairly easily lots of refugee groups and churches and mosques and so on, who are full of people who've mostly recently arrived, I guess, in many cases, or certainly they carry the problem of a very vague immigration system, effectively. So where there is an issue of irregular workers mostly end up in mosques and churches, frankly, and the church has a great tradition of housing the homeless and indeed the refugee. So the two areas, I guess, that Citizens UK could contribute to is the issue of wages. We are the living wage people. That came from us as the Civil Society Alliance and remains with us. That means that anybody who has the money to pay a living wage, £8.80 in London and £7.65 outside, and that's set really in London by the mayor, the Conservative mayor, should, if they have the money, pay it. And we now have 866 accredited living wage employers, including the LSE, of course, and a whole series of respectable... And the TUC, and pretty well every union, and 20 local authorities, and indeed Nestle's, and most banks, and so on. So that's important, because that does mean if people are in work, they should benefit from being in work. rather than not. 5 government departments pay it. It's incrementally moving across Whitehall, particularly Ian Duncan Smith, who to a certain extent took a lead because of universal benefits. You can't argue that, frankly, work should pay if you don't actually pay enough money, and the living wages we estimate, and the Mayor's office estimates enough to just about live on and spend time with your children. The cause for living wage for us is basically a family one, so that people don't have to have 2 jobs and can spend time with their children. That's where this all came from. So that's one area. The other area, as I say, is the area of refugees, asylum seekers and so on, which we work very closely with. We are the people who launched the Strangers into Citizens campaign in 2006 and packed Trafalgar Square, and the biggest turnout ever in favour of a earned regularisation. That issue remains in this country. Nobody wants to touch it apart from ourselves, because our members are picking up the problem all the time. There are still large numbers of irregular workers here. We argued that, frankly, if they're here and they've put their roots down and they have not got a criminal record, they should be allowed to stay in a programmed way. It's up to the state how they do it, but basically they're not going to go home. It'll take 25 years to deport the number of people the LSE estimates are here with no papers.
Well, what is the number roughly, just the current estimate?
500,000 to 1 million it is. Nobody really knows, because they are irregular by definition. There's probably less than there were because of the financial crisis, but there's still large numbers of people come here for work, and you see that happening at Calais. So I hope that you will look at what to do about how popular this country is for folks for economic reasons. The other area which is important to us, and so the issue of irregular workers has not gone away. Every country has it, and Britain has it, and frankly mostly we sort of ignore it, apart from the Catholic Church, which is pretty good in basically saying the same thing. If they're here and they've put their roots down and they're possibly married and they have children, they should be given protection of the law, and the state just can't ignore that problem, that challenge.
Neil, what I found quite interesting was the role you said about of churches and mosques. Do you think churches and mosques play quite a crucial? What's the evidence around them helping people into work? Because obviously the government's got the work programme, etc., and it's all very focused on how charities and employers can help. But how is there any evidence on the kind of positive role that churches and mosques play in helping people into work?
Not much, I think. We have, on 3 occasions, converted the members of London Citizens, particularly in London here, therefore, so London Citizens is a part of Citizens UK, into job centres. I think they're much undervalued, these institutions. They are loved by their members, which is why they're packed out. And in the Olympics, we managed to get 2,000 people into jobs via their institutions that set up recruitment centres, effectively. East London Mosque did a fantastic job at getting people into work who would not normally go to the job centre. This was fast-tracking people for work in living wage jobs, and that worked very well. But that's a sort of one-off experiment. We've done the same thing with Tech City Stars, using, in this case, could be a alliance of schools and churches and mosques, and schools and colleges can also become job centres in our experience. That young people take more seriously the principles, or their teacher, much-loved teacher, saying, you need to come after school to a meeting where we've got an opportunity for you to sign up for jobs, which this college has got for you through Citizens UK.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much. Let's move finally now to Professor Mannings.
Yeah, well, I'm Alan Manning from the LSE, an academic. Okay, so I'll just try and be very brief. Obviously, many people are absolutely convinced that immigration has had a very large effect on work and poverty in the UK. And I think it's absolutely clear that the strength of those convictions is not really based on any very strong evidence. I mean, there's an academic literature on what the effect actually has been, of which I've done something, and none of that is very conclusive. Probably the balance of opinion suggests that immigration has provided a small net benefit to natives, but there have almost certainly been some losers, because all change, immigration, other sorts of change, tends to have winners and losers, even not changing when other people are has winners and losers. So, I mean, it would be surprising if there were no losers, but it's proved very difficult to really identify any large group of losers which have had sizable losses. And the simplest way of putting that is that if we take the extremely rapid immigration that we had after the accession of the Eastern European countries, in the years following that, before the crisis, the employment rate of British natives was at the highest level it had been for a generation. The unemployment rate was at the lowest level it had been for a generation. And you might say, well, there's pressing down on wages, but actually wage inequality at the bottom part of the UK wage distribution was at the lowest level it had been for a generation. So those years immediately following 2004 were the best years in a generation for low-skilled British workers. Things have gone...
years.
Pardon?
A generation's not a very long time.
Well, 25, 30 years,
And
okay.
And for males in full-time employment, the figure was miles higher in the 60s and 70s.
I don't disagree. In 60s and 70s, the employment rate was much higher. But we're talking about going back to the way things were in the early 80s. I mean, we've had the 60s and 70s unemployment rate was 2%. Nobody in their wildest dreams thinks that's a credible target now. It'll be interesting to debate why that is. But I don't think the reason why it isn't is primarily the immigration that we've had since then. So I think that it just sort of doesn't really stack up that there was a massive effect of immigration on the British labour market at that point. But I think there probably were losers, and a big failure of policy was really, as I think was said earlier, it was really a failure to manage the consequences of migration when the actual flows turn out to be much higher than had been estimated. People just shrug their shoulders and go, oh well, even though that has consequences for different people in different areas, and nobody was really engaging with what those consequences were and doing anything to try and mitigate.
Okay, just a question to Owen. In terms of immigrants engaging with unions, what's the kind of pattern there? Are immigrants more likely to engage with unions, or?
Our unions don't tend to collect data by migration status, so what I'm going to say is probably rather more on the anecdotal line than on the hard evidence line. But all the indications that we've got are that actually migrants behave exactly like co-workers. If they go into a highly unionised workplace, they join a union. If they go into a very ununionised workplace, they don't join a union. And it's really pretty much as simple as that. So if they go to work in the NHS, they join a union. If they go to work in a hotel, they don't. There's a slight difference. We could look at if you look at large scale agriculture and food production, there does seem to have been a change, which is that's people going into a predominantly ununionised environment or lowly unionised environment, where actually I think in the 2010 period union density rates actually increased. But actually, I think that's less to do with the number of migrants who came into the industry. It's more to do with the way the industry changed to become more of a large workplace industry where, bluntly, we find it easier to organise anyway, regardless. So actually, our experience is that there isn't much in people's migration status to indicate whether they are more or less likely to organise. And I think it is. I mean, one thing that we've noticed a change on over those generations is that the last 10, 15 years of migration has resulted in workplaces that are actually more harmonious than previous waves of migration have led to. I mean, there is some evidence, as I said, of workforce segregation going on, but actually the experience of those people who've worked in industries over a number of decades is that actually the latest waves of migration have been more integrated into workplaces than previous waves. That doesn't tell you what happens when they go home at night. There you've got substantial, I think, community segregation. But in terms of workplaces, we see them as in this sense, having coped slightly better with migration than in previous waves.
Okay, thank you. Sunder.
Owen, you talked about the impacts of the pace of change and going along with other economic changes that are going on at the same time. Seems to be the trickiest bit of this is around that it's EU free movement, and so the number of levers is limited. But we're obviously going to have a very big debate about what changes would you make to the European Union stay in? What would you bring in terms of a sort of protection agenda, fairness agenda? What would be important in terms of, presumably you want to keep free movement? What would you put in it to keep it?
Yeah, we do think free movement of workers as one of the 4 freedoms of the European Union is crucial to maintain. Partly because it balances the other freedoms. Sorry, I should say. I think we would say that the overriding principle that people ought to operate on is that when people move into a particular country or community or whatever, that they are treated as if they were part of that country or community. And our concern has been that migration flows from low-wage economies into high-wage economies have brought the low wages with them. So that, not exactly and not in any necessarily planned way, but the problem has been, and Ireland, for instance, had a better example of this than the UK. A lot of the noise of a larger economy drowns out some of this stuff. But what you were seeing was people being paid roughly according to the wage levels they would expect back home, rather than the wage levels they would expect here. And I think that's been the problem. That's where the depression of wages at the lower end of the labour market has been experienced. It's that sort of change. So the sort of changes that we would want to see to make it possible to cope with that circumstance is to make sure that effectively, and I'm not suggesting this is actually how you'd write it into legislation, that the rate for the job would not be changed by a change in the composition of the workforce in that way. And I think, the actual practical measures I think you go to are you control 0 hours contracts, you control temporary agency work rights, you control working time and minimum wages, things like that. I think the experience of minimum wages is worth noting. One of the reasons I think why you didn't see quite as much change at the bottom end of the labour market in the early part of the 21st century was because you had a minimum wage that underpinned that. In Germany, where you didn't have a minimum wage at that stage, still don't quite yet, you actually did see the €1 an hour job evolving on construction sites. Can I just say one thing, however, about free movement of workers? It's an interesting distinction that under transitional arrangements, I think, to be blunt, it's very unlikely that any large countries are going to join in the next immediate period in Europe anyway, so this is a slightly hypothetical discussion at the moment. But under transitional arrangements, such as we've seen, self-employed workers are allowed to move freely from day one, whereas employees are controlled for up to however many years it is, 7 years and that. It strikes me goes to the heart of that deregulation of the labour market. If sort of one of the reasons we didn't see large numbers of Romanians and Bulgarians coming to Britain on the 1st of January this year was because quite a lot of them were already here as self-employed workers. They could just transfer their employment arrangements from self-employment to permanent employment. That seems to me to be a bizarre differentiation to make, and all it does is encourage people to become self-employed and therefore less regulated than if they were employed.
Okay, thank you. Kate.
Neil, as someone who has a bit of expertise about the Church of England, what you said about churches and mosques rang very true with me, that so often they are indeed safety nets and points of integration. But given the number of, every church has its marginals. It's people who are looked after by the church, who are often in between homelessness and not on and off benefits, often drug problems, that sort of thing. And I was wondering how you felt churches and mosques were doing with challenging, particularly for native British workers and for native British marginals, those myths that we've been hearing about. about the problems of immigration, about challenging the culture of blame. And I thought Owen might have something to add on that in terms of how unions are working as well to counter that segregation between workforces.
I guess as an individual, churches and mosques are not doing very well, other than recognising that they shoulder to shoulder with people who are migrants, mostly have arrived recently, and every church, as you say, has got a group of people that are basically they're feeding or clothing. And that's always been the nature of the relationship. And actually, when any immigration system fails, if the state fails, if you fail effectively by not coming up with good enough proposals, it's usually faith that picks it up. It's sort of natural. But I mean, the Church of England, clearly, the Archbishop is pretty outspoken about a variety of things. He's chosen not, I think, to speak on issues of immigration, but he has on payday lending. And the Church of England is taking a good lead on trying to get people into credit unions, I know, which is something. But Vincent Nichols is also very supportive of the regularisation plight of large numbers of people who are Catholics who've come from other places, who are basically unable to work or are working in the black economy effectively. So it's really the church leaders, I think, who are taking a lead. The Muslim Council of Britain is awash with trying to rebut the myths about Islam and the terrible reputation that is happening internationally for them, and they haven't certainly spoken in on these sorts of issues.
Can I just pick up the point? I mean, let me be absolutely honest. The trade union movement is not at its best in looking after those people who are furthest away from the labour market. You know, we represent people at work. So if they're on the streets, that's less. But no, absolutely. At work, indeed, and we do our bit on credit unions for people at the bottom end of the labour market as well. And in terms of, I mean, we very often talk about language classes for migrants and things like that, and we provide some access to that through our Union Learn activity. Actually, that's not very different from the work that our Union Learn people do about basic literacy and numeracy for people who are born here and have communication problems and problems like that. So there is some work like that. I think that the main area of our work that impacts on that, though, is whilst we're in favour of greater regulation of, whether it's the workplace or the private rented sector or so on, what we don't think helps are measures which are inherently divisive or split people apart, which I think is one of the problems with turning doctors, landlords, teachers, employers into part of the border force. Because I think that will only encourage division of people. If you're, if you're a private sector landlord and you have to make a decision about whether you think you should be renting your property to someone on the basis of their migration status, that's only going to increase social divisions rather than relax them. So I think that's one of the reasons why they shouldn't be used as border police. I mean, another reason is they're not very good at it. So I prefer to have it in the hands of professionals. But
okay, thank you, Carlos.
Alan, there's a headline in the newspapers that comes often that says 80-90% of new jobs go to migrants. Could you explain if that is accurate according to the data, and if it is, what it really means or it doesn't mean? And also for Neil, you were talking about irregular migration, and we discussed the estimates. I mean, those estimates are quite old. They're based on the 2001 census, and those were the last estimates from the government. There's nothing stopping the Home Office to having annual estimates of irregular migrants in the UK. Would that help your work to have annual estimates of that population? Would that be useful, or is it better just to have no estimates of that population?
Well, the problem is I don't know how they would do that, because it's often students who stay on. Clearly the system, as I understand it, is getting better at recording when people come into the country, but that's only very recently that's happened. For the folks who came in 2-3 years ago, there's no record of when they have to go back, but as I understand it. It might help, but it also might cause panic, frankly. I think, in my experience, I work in East London, that people live fairly happily with their neighbours who are have all sorts of backgrounds. As I say, there is an issue about making the country more dangerous if there are large numbers of people here who can't have recall to the police, who are likely to be threatened by exploitative employers and so on. So, or I suppose what we're suggesting is there should be, which is our original proposal, a one-off regularisation, so those people who've been here a long time, the government can work out the terms, should be allowed to stay and work. Boris Johnson is a great supporter of this because of the loss of money to the exchequer by people not working, or if they are working, they're working below the radar, and nobody gets their taxes. And our experience of those folk is they are pretty enterprising to have got here in the first place. It's really not easy to get here. And to get here to study and then want to stay is perfectly natural. Clearly the country has the right to decide whether they should...
Can I just ask you on this, what are the lessons of the 2010 election where you had broad support from trade unions, Boris Johnson, Liberal Democrats? There clearly wasn't public or political consent to do it. Probably the biggest issue is, even if it was compassionate to do it once for some people, it would be an enormous pull factor when you do it every time, and so we will only consider it if we really thought it was a one-off. I mean, were there any lessons either in how you make the case or what you have to offer people to go with it, not to get stuck there?
We had the support of the Liberal Democrats. We lost the campaign in the merger for the coalition agreement. That's what went. What stayed in was the no more locking up of children and families in immigration detention centres, which was a deal done
The
effectively.
Liberal Democrats themselves were very badly bruised by their experience.
They did say it affected their reputation on the doorstep, that's right.
So how do you campaign differently for it after seeing that happen?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, it isn't popular. On the other hand, people know that it exists, and as I say, the constituency we have, which is mostly faith, and it's schools and colleges and so on who live with the challenge, would like somebody to sort it out because it makes it easier.
Sorry, can I just ask another question on this point? I mean, is it plausible to link regularisation with moving to somewhere else in the country, or moving to a specific place where apparently immigration is needed more? Scotland, for example, goes on about how much it would prefer to have.
Scotland just at the moment.
Obviously we have free movement within the United Kingdom, so people can come straight back. But actually, that might make it more sellable. You can come out of the shadows, but you've got to go to Hartlepool or Edinburgh.
Quite difficult to police that one, I think. It's a
London,
point.
Most of it is London.
Yes, there were like registered asylum seekers are indeed sent to other places which because they're given free accommodation.
No, I'm talking about illegal immigrants and natural and normalisation.
I think it would be difficult to make that happen. I mean, people there in London because there's more work here.
But I think there is an issue, which is that the public debate that we need to have to answer Sunder's question about this is how you earn that status. And I think that's one of the problems that people have with the policy, which is that it's expressed very often as being merely an amnesty, which just puts the emphasis solely on that one question: are you here legally or not? Which for many irregular migrants is difficult to say, because some people can swing 1 week to the next from being within their visa conditions to outside their visa conditions and so on. I mean, that's possibly at the extreme. But there's the issue, but if you put it more about earned status, then I think that's a more popular message that can be sold. I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of the idea as a trade unionist that some people can jump the queue for getting into the UK by going, by being trafficked, which is anathema anyway, or by paying extra or anything like that. So I think there are basic questions about fairness, about how you get into a country in the first place. But then there are questions of fairness about what, I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about not just rights but also responsibilities in terms of what people do when they're in the economy.
Right, sorry, Professor Manning, just to come to Carlos's point.
First point, yeah, okay. So you sort of said the sort of headline, 80-90% of new jobs go to immigrants. So the way that would be computed is they take total employment a year ago, they take total employment now, the difference between the two is the number of new jobs, then they work out how the employment of immigrants has gone up, how the employment of natives has gone up. And typically, the number you would get is that employment is rising primarily because the labour force is rising, and if the labour force is rising primarily because of immigration, net immigration, you get a very high number on that for the share of new jobs going to immigrants. But there's a sort of slip then between what is a new job. To most of us, a new job is when someone gets a job. And that's not what this number is about at all. So there's huge churn in the labour market all the time. So if you actually say, take all the people starting a new job this Monday or whatever and say what fraction of them are immigrants, you're going to get a number that's probably around, I haven't done it lately, but sort of probably 15, 20%, i.e. much, much closer to the actual share of the immigrants than the population, the labour force as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think it's also a mistake to think, and this is something that labour economists call the lump of labour fallacy, that if we didn't have the immigration, i.e. if we didn't have the growth in the labour force, we would actually have all these new jobs. And I think that's actually incorrect. But generally, the number of jobs tends to follow the size of the labour force. If you reduce the growth in the labour force through less immigration, you would reduce the growth in the number of jobs. So you don't actually deliver more jobs for British people. I mean, this is not new to immigration. When women were entering the labour force in large numbers, you would have got similar figures. 80% to 90% of new jobs are going to women. If only women weren't entering the labour force, we would have all those higher number of jobs for men. And all the evidence is across countries that there is so little...
There has been displacement of full-time male employment.
Sorry?
There has been displacement of male employment, quite significant.
Not displacement. I don't accept displacement. There's been a decline in male employment. I don't think that's from labour force entry of women, because if you look across countries... No, I don't think that's true at all. If you look across countries, in which even to this day there are countries with very high... No, well, it's sort of... There is an analogy, because I think the analogy is natural to think of immigration as increasing the labour force, just as the entry of women did. If you look across countries, I mean, to this day, some countries have had greater entry of women into the labour force than other countries. It's simply not true that the countries with more entry of women have lower employment rates for men. It's not true that countries which have high rates of population growth have lower employment rates for men. It's just not really true.
Okay, thank you. David.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask a more political question, really, which is that we're all agreed, even Jonathan Porter's earlier agreed, that the economic effects of large-scale immigration is broadly neutral. But there also seems to be pretty wide consensus that it's also economically regressive to the extent that there are negative impacts. They're concentrated on the lower end of the labour market, downward pressure on wages, some job displacement, 25% youth unemployment in London. Would it be lower if there wasn't free movement of young Europeans? Yes, I suspect it would be a bit lower. What interests me, we have two important institutions of the British left. In fact, three, really. The LSE, a great Fabian institution.
I think they've abandoned that ground, to be honest.
Why, large-scale immigration increases competition in the labour market. I mean, there's no question about that. It increases competition in the labour market. And I would say, to some extent, it undermines national social contracts. I mean, with the greatest cheerleaders for large-scale immigration, Simon Walker, the head of the Institute of Directors. Why do you, at the TUC and UK citizens, not oppose large-scale immigration? Why do you not call for greater restrictions on it? I mean, is it because there are still associations between immigration and race, and that calling for restrictions associates you in some way with racial prejudice? I mean, it just seems, on the face of it, your organisations should be, not completely, but returning to more moderate levels of immigration is a policy that would benefit your members. Why do you not call for it?
Can I leave in quickly, because I just want to make it clear we're a non-partisan organisation, not from the left at all. It may sound that our campaigns are, but we are a democratic organisation. Because we have members, they decide on the issues that we pursue and our position. We tend not to take big positions on immigration, frankly, because it would divide the organisation. Frankly,
living wage is your main.
Living wages, yes.
Yeah, and is that a policy of the left or the right? I mean,
well, the business, it's a policy of the main best corporations are doing it now. But to answer your question, I think our members have not raised the issue of immigration. again, because we're based in East London would be empty without immigration, frankly. Everybody has somebody they know in their family or distantly who came to this country seeking work.
But recent immigrants are only slightly more in favour of large-scale immigration than natives, which means they're strongly opposed to it.
Sure.
By 10 or 15 points
it's
lower
a
or whatever.
testament to the assimilation of
No,
recent
it's not. I mean,
migrants.
it's perfectly rational and sensible. I mean, everybody wants to be the last immigrant.
I don't actually accept the argument that our members' interests would be served by restricting the number of migrants coming into the UK. I think that overall, I think that the evidence of past waves of migration and the evidence of what evidence we read from academics like Alan and so on suggests that on balance there is a marginal improvement in the average state of our members' conditions as a result of migration, partly as a result of it being an indication of a dynamic economy.
It's partly also because you now represent middle-class workers more than working-class workers. I think the average trade unionist in Britain now has a degree. So actually, you are on the wrong side of the regressive argument in a way that your members probably do benefit.
It depends. Yeah, there are all sorts of pinhead arguments about. Angels on about what bit of the working class we represent, and we're always being accused of representing the wrong bit of the working class for any particular argument. On average, working people are better served by migration than by restrictions on migration. And the US labour movement has, I'm happy to provide lots of evidence.
It's at best neutral, but not for people in the bottom half.
Can I just say, look, no, this is not, the problem is, what I want to say is the problem comes when you talk about averages and overall positions. I use this slightly tongue-in-cheek, but if I lined all six of you up against a wall and punched one of you, on average I wouldn't have punched anybody. But one of you would have a bloody nose. Well, actually, probably only a slightly bruised nose. I haven't got quite that power in my elbow that I used to have. But the problem is there are examples of people who have been disadvantaged as a result of migration. And I think what we need to do is we need to address their concerns and the concerns of other people who feel that they might be in that group. But it isn't. But the overall figures, I think, are not as you suggest. That just doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing things to deal with those issues. And I think we get into a slightly futile and pointless debate if we do that. Is it good? Is it bad? The long tradition of the labour movement actually is to try and address the bad bits and see if we can maximise the good bits.
Okay, I'm going to bring Matthew.
Quickly come in on that point and just ask a question to Alan, because John Portes said this morning the same thing as you, which is we sort of know there are losers out there, but we don't really know who the losers are. We don't really know which groups have suffered versus which haven't. Now, going back to sort of evidence on this, I mean, why is that? That seems deeply dissatisfactory to me, that we just don't know who's been negatively hit, but we kind of know some people have.
Well, I mean, what it means is that our ability to identify groups, this is sort of statistical analysis of data. So the group of losers has to be large enough so that when you take a random sample of the population, there are enough people that you've actually got data on in the losers group, and the effect of them has got to be large enough to be able to be distinguishable from all the other stuff that's going on causing people's earnings. And the simple answer is they're not. Nobody's identified.
So there's no social characteristics that stand out?
I mean, there are some studies that claim there's, for example, one well-known study claims a negative effect at the bottom of the wage distribution. That paper omits the effects of the minimum wage. In a period that this is the Dussman, Frattini and Preston. And it's extraordinary. I mean, at the moment we've been working on actually, if you put in the minimum wage, it just sort of goes away. So none of this is very clear cut. So And I think it really would take issue with what David said about it's obvious that it increases labour competition. There's more supply of labour. But more supply of labour leads to more demand for labour. It's not obvious at all that there's more competition.
Just a minor point quickly, is that the same in terms of the international evidence? That economists in other states cannot identify key groups that might have...
I mean, there are studies that find some negative effects. I mean, none of these things are very, very, very large. And this then goes back to the point of, well, I suppose you did think there was a negative effect. You've got to have some policy. It's not so easy as saying I press a button and I have less migration.
Well, it's just interesting given, I mean, the broader aims of this sort of work and programme, that if you look at public opinion, there are key social groups that are far more hostile towards low-skilled and high-skilled migration than others, and the assumption would be, well, those are the groups that are you feel as though they are losing out somewhere, but that's not.
I think, well, for example, I'll give an example of why I think public perception is so negative. So if you say, take the stereotypical Polish plumber coming in, he offers to do a job that a British plumber would have done, he does it cheaper. So it's then very obvious to the British plumber, I've lost this job because of this immigrant. And I feel I've been harmed by it. But actually, that isn't the full, that's not where it stops. That's where most people's analysis stops. But the householder who's now got this plumbing job done cheaper than they had before, well, they've got some money left over. So what are they going to do for that? They think, oh, I might go and get my hair cut. So suddenly a hairdresser has got increased employment because of this immigrant. But nobody is going to be able to say, oh, that low-paid hairdresser has got a job because of immigration, because it's so indirect. But it's very, very real, all of that. So people's analysis just stops at the first stage, and the economy just isn't like that. And
but can I just say?
I'm just going to bring, because we're running out of time, but just to say, Philip Legrand yesterday was talking about a lot of the studies don't capture some of the wider dynamic benefits. For example, you might get more competition, etc., which may reduce the cost of goods, therefore reducing the cost of living for people on very modest incomes. But the data, the evidence doesn't capture that. So there could be more positive impacts, economic impact from immigration than is first assumed, but it's just not measurable. Anyway, David.
Well, just, this session is called Work and Poverty. We haven't really talked about poverty. One way of looking at the relationship between large-scale immigration and poverty is to say that actually we have a lot more poverty and probably somewhat more inequality than we would have had without it. One way of assessing that is to look at the poverty rate for ethnic minority Britons, which is roughly double the rate of white British, or maybe the whole population. About 20% of the population, possibly a little bit less, are classified as in poverty, and about, according to Joseph Rowntree and other organisations, about 40% of ethnic minority Britain is classified as poor. Now, they're obviously not all immigrants in the sense of born abroad, but about half of them are. So large-scale immigration has increased poverty in Britain. Is that correct?
No, there is. Can I just say at one point that to challenge that? I don't entirely disagree with you, right? But I think there's a point that needs to be raised about that. Several points. Number one is some of those people obviously will actually, whilst being poor now that they're here, would actually be richer now than they were sort of before they moved. So there is exactly. Well, you hope. There are countries where that's not the case. There's lots of people who are poorer in Qatar than they were in Nepal, but they can't get out. So so there's partly that. Secondly, yes, if you change the size of a population, you may well change it by increasing by changing which bit of the population you've increased. So if you have more poor people coming into the economy, then you may have a higher number of poor people in the economy than you did before. But if you let in more rich people, you might have more rich people in the population than you did before. London is not entirely a case, not in point in that sense, the West rather than the East, I suspect. But what I'd say is that these are not necessarily features of migration. They can also be features of the way in which you have structured your economy or your society to deal with things. One of the reasons why people may well be poorer now than they were, or there's a higher distribution of poverty, may actually be government policy about wage rates and employment rights and collective bargaining and so on. That may actually be what's changed it, and it may simply be an associational effect that you've got large numbers of migrants at the same time.
Well, why is that so disproportionately affecting
Well,
people with ethnic minority background?
No, it's ethnic minority backgrounds from very poor, low educated. I mean, it's those groups. I mean, I think, to generalise is the mistake. Obviously, a low skilled worker can't get into the UK currently. I mean, there's the family reunion, there's the family route and so on. So we've closed down that on that. I mean, now if you say, why did we ever allow very low educated immigrant groups into the country, which is, it was because we felt we had a need. This was when, the unemployment rate was extremely low. Places like the textile industry were losing out and felt that they could, had a cheaper source of labour.
We felt we had a colonial obligation to.
And there's a mix. There's a lot of things, but this is yesterday's thing. I mean,
So would you if the immigration system got tighter on low-skilled migration, you'd expect the kind of composition of the population, the composition of the ethnic minority population, which is impoverished, to be lower?
No, I mean, it's all very static. I mean, yes, in a sense, if you let in lots of low-skilled workers with no educational qualifications, of which there are very large numbers in the world who would like to come here, yes, that would increase the poverty rates in the UK, but that's not where we are currently. And it's misleading to say that we...
And again, possibly only on day one.
And
every day they're in the UK, they will
groups,
change, that composition will change.
Down the generations, that they're actually doing pretty well, most of them.
But 40% are still in poverty, as David said.
Well, I'm not sure whether that's the exact...
that's the
Joseph
Rantry data.
But it's simply not necessarily the result of migration. It may well be the result of the fact that we have more low skill, low pay, low security jobs on offer. I mean, the reason why we've had the longest pay squeeze in I think it's now recorded economic history is not as a result of migration. It's as a result of things like the government deciding not to award pay increases to public sector workers. That's what's done it, not migration.
So I take that point. So Neil, you've got the final word.
On that issue, you mean?
On everything, I think.
Yes.
Well, I was going to add 3 more little challenges for you, because I know you're looking this afternoon, because we're a broad-based organisation and broad issues are our forte, effectively. There are issues about indeterminate locking up of people in detention centres, which I hope you're going to look at this afternoon. Britain is the only country in Europe that locks people up and they don't know when they're going to get out. That's one issue. There's another issue, which the very high rate for the threshold rate for spouses who married legitimately coming into this country makes it almost impossible for Pakistani marriages and so on, which are legitimate, to be united. And that needs looking at. We think the living wage rate would be a good one to focus on, as well as the number of legitimate refugees that are allowed into this country. This doesn't necessarily answer the question about work, of course. Britain only allows, in theory, 750 refugees into this country, legitimately approved by the UNHCR. That seems ridiculous. 750 a year is the limit for a legitimate UNHCR approved refugees who can be offered accommodation by local authorities. Sundar may want to correct that.
But we have 20 or 30,000 people coming in under the asylum.
We have 22,000 asylum applications a year, and you're talking about.
But these are people from refugee camps.
From camps, sorry.
From camps, really, would be. There are 3 million Syrian refugees looking, I think, frankly, the time now, that going back to Sundar's point about why in 2010 the asylum, we missed the regularisation. Certainly it wouldn't be possible to do now, but it would be possible, I think, for the country to frankly say, let's have some more refugees, because this plight of the thousands of people you do see every day who are living in camps touches everybody, left, right and centre, frankly, and to have just 750 in, when, as I understand it, only 50 Syrian refugees are now here legitimately that way. That doesn't answer your question, but I'd leave those for you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. No, that's very good points. Okay, thank you to all three of you. Thank you for your time. And